So this is a Phase 1 camera with an FX body, an IQ 150 digital back, and an 80mm lens. And this whole setup costs around $50,000. And essentially, these are really just the high-end medium format cameras that are typically used in the commercial world. One of the great things about these cameras are how modular and interchangeable they are. Obviously, you have many different lens options, and then you also have the EVF that you can look through, or if you want, you can do a waist level viewfinder, which is typical to many medium format cameras, film or digital. And the most important part of the camera is the digital back, which is where your sensor is located, and it is why these cameras cost so much. The sensors on these are 2.5 times bigger than the size of a DSLR camera, so the amount of detail you can get out of these is just insane. And also because of the bigger sensors on this thing, your RAW files are going to be a lot more accurate to what your eyes see than any other camera that's out there. This camera also has 15 stops of dynamic range, which is just crazy on its own. You can also shoot time lapses, HDRs, and there's even an exposure calculator, which basically quickly helps you figure out the exposure for a slower shutter speed. So instead of having to actually, take the time to test it yourself, you can just quickly do it all in this camera. There are also a couple different focus options. Obviously, you have autofocus and manual focus, which you can just easily change here on the lens. And there's also focus trim, hyperfocal, and focus stacking. So the focus point on this is directly in the center, and you can't move it around like you can on DSLR and mirrorless cameras. So you do have some limitations there, but it is also very doable. Like if you shot film, you're kind of used to it, so it's not that big of a challenge. So this IQ 150 digital back has a 50 megapixel sensor and an ISO range from 100 to 6400, and it costs $30,000. So for the XF body series, the ISO range on these is not very good. So I would recommend definitely shooting in a lot of light and keep your ISO as low as possible, because if you kind of bump it too high, it's just not going to look good. So there are a couple different back models, and the newer and more advanced you go, the more it costs. So the new IQ4 back, which is a 150 megapixel sensor, costs $52,000 just by itself. So for memory, depending on which back you get, they can either take CF cards, XQD cards, or SD cards, and the IQ 150 back that I have right here takes CF cards, and for a Nikon / Sony user as myself, I kind of had to go out and buy some CF cards. So the menu system on this camera is pretty easy to navigate. It is touch controlled, and then there are also some buttons on the back as well that you can use to control. So it is very laid out very well and not as complicated as some Sony and Canon menu systems are. And then you can easily also change the settings on it through touch control, and then there's also dials on the camera as well. So it is very similar to Nikon's in the fact that it's touch and dial. And then for your image playback, you're able to zoom in pretty close to your image, which is nice. You also have your histogram, and then you have a focus and exposure warning. So you can turn those on, see if your image is in focus or, something is overexposed. But it's kind of hard to tell because, the LCD screen isn't that big. That's why I would always recommend shooting tethered with this camera so you can actually see your image better. And then at the top, you also have another touch LCD screen, which is nice to help navigate. You can go in and individually change your shutter and your aperture and stuff like that from there as well. And then if you swipe through the different menus, you also have your HDR, your time-lapse, your focus stack, and you can also control a ProPhoto Power Pack, which is compatible with the Phase 1 system, which is very helpful instead of having, go run to your pack and run back to the camera every time. You also have a seismograph, which shows you how much motion. So if you need a still image and the graph is like going up and down, that means obviously your camera is shaking a little bit. And then once it's completely a flat line, that's how your camera is 100% steady. You do also have a leveler, which is very helpful, if your tripod doesn't have one. And then you can also lock this screen in case you're accidentally, touching it, because it is kind of close to the shutter button, and you keep pressing it and things just keep moving on their own. But yeah, it's a very nice and easy menu system to navigate, and instead of, having to get lost in the menu system on the back for things like the time lapse or the focus mode, it's just very easy to just swipe up top there and go through them. So this camera is a little bit heavier than most DSLR and mirrorless cameras. I'd say it weighs about 2 to 4 pounds, which isn't that bad, but kind of, after a long time, it does start to feel heavy. So I would definitely recommend wearing the camera strap just because of how much this thing costs. And, I'm kind of renting this at the moment, so I definitely don't want to drop it. So camera strap is always going to be your safest bet when you're using this expensive of a camera. So the tripod mount on this camera is a little bit bigger than most normal tripod mounts, probably because you want a more steadier tripod for how much this does weigh. So you could obviously get a different tripod, or if you just want to stick with your basic kind of tripods that work for all your cameras, you can get a little mount adapter kind of like this one has, and it will work on most tripods. You can also easily tether this to a computer with the Capture One editing software, and then see your images bigger on a computer screen instead of very small and tiny on the back of the LCD screen. So now that I've gone over the specs and the settings that you would use, let's see what this camera can actually do. Alright, so now that I got the shot here with the Phase 1 behind me, I'm also going to take some with my Nikon Z6 here just to do some comparisons between the two. Alright, so on the Z6 now, and I haven't changed anything for the lights, and then all my settings are the same, so shutter speed is 1/200th of a second, f16 is my aperture, ISO 100, and then I'm at an 80mm focal length, and already you can tell that the 80mm focal length is a lot more zoomed in on my mirrorless camera than on the Phase 1, so it is interesting to see the difference in focal lengths between the two. And I'm also going to be doing some comparison shots here with the Sony a7S III, but instead I'm going to be using a 35mm focal length because I don't have an 80mm lens for this. Alright, so we are in Lightroom now, and then on the left here we have the Phase 1 image, and then on the right is the Z6 image. So kind of, overall looking at it, just normal. You can already tell there's some difference. Obviously the Phase 1 is lighter, even though I didn't change anything. So it's interesting kind of how these cameras take in light differently. So yeah, obviously, this one kind of just looks better overall zoomed out. And then when you zoom in, that's when you really see the details and how much different this Phase 1 can capture details compared to a mirrorless camera. So, obviously just looking at the powdered sugar, you get a lot more details and you kind of see the individual specs of it more than you do on the Z6. And then kind of just in the jelly here, like on the Z6, it's there. It doesn't look as sharp and not really much to it. But then on the Phase here, it's just so incredibly detailed and the colors are pretty accurate as well. And it's just pretty crazy. And then if we go over here, there's a shadow one, like jelly section as well. On the Z6, it can kind of get just washed out and you can't really tell it's there. But then on the Phase, it's just so detailed with the shadows, and it's just incredible what this camera can do. Even though, some of these aren't even in focus that much either, it's just, you can really tell the difference in the details. And then on the knife as well, it just looked really realistic and really sharp and detailed compared to the Z6. It looks kind of flat, and it's just not as detailed, but that's kind of what you expect when you have a $40,000 camera and a sensor that's so big. So obviously, when you're comparing the two, the Phase 1 is going to win in detail, hands down, kind of all the way. And then now we're over here in Capture One, because for some reason Capture One does not read my raw NEF files, which is what Nikon files are. But on the left here now is the A7 III, and then on the right is the Phase 1. So obviously you're still going to get a big difference in details and colors. The Phase 1 is obviously still brighter, and the Sony is a little bit darker still. Obviously, again with the jelly, just not as much detail as you get out of the Phase, and the knife, still looks flat. So comparing between just two different mirrorless cameras, they're pretty much the same to each other, but compared to the Phase, they just don't really, stand a chance comparing details. Like, it's just insane looking at how detailed this Phase image here is on the right. It's just like I could get lost just staring at the details all day. But then kind of the big difference with the phase, like I mentioned, the focus is not great. So I'm going to turn on the focus mask right now, and everything in this green is in focus. So obviously you can tell how much better the focus I was able to get with the Sony was over the Phase 1, because the focus on the Phase 1 is just centered, and it still haven't got the hang of it yet, while it's just so easy to focus on these mirrorless systems. So it is interesting how expensive this camera is, but how not great and delicate the focus is. So that's why, you really want to be tethered shooting when you are using this expensive of a camera, because it's like, it's kind of sucks to get, this great of details and how great of image quality you can get and just not have it in focus compared to how much you can get in focus with a camera that's like $2,000. So definitely need to be working on my focus with this Phase 1 camera. So with the amount of detail you're able to get out of this camera, it does make sense why this camera costs so much. But like I mentioned, it's kind of hard to get your focus right, and unless you know every little thing about this camera, I would recommend shooting tethered to a computer whenever you do end up using this camera. Now I know that these are really expensive cameras and that most photographers you meet won't be able to spend 40 to 50K on a camera, but if you get the chance to use one of these cameras, I would definitely recommend it, because as the further you get into your photography career, at some point you just might start to see these cameras pop up.